Hello, everyone. This is David Leibowitz with Philosophy Game Philosophy, and I'm here with the fantastic, amazing Mr. Amazing to talk, who is a very established YouTuber and a good friend of mine. He is a
That's right.
Hegelian. He's a Hegelian. We actually did a podcast together in my political podcast, um, where we talked about very complex intellectual stuff, and we will continue on with complex intellectual stuff. And this, he's not much of a gamer. He's never. How much are you familiar with this? With ever heard of the Fallout series?
I know of it. I know, it takes place in a, post-nuclear wasteland relatively, but that's about all I know.
All right. So I think this, if I'm correct, this is the one that people love. And I've not played this game myself, but I did a podcast on this with a guy who does love the game, and we talked to he's a Kantian. So we talked about how people, which from a Kantian perspective is the most accurate, is the best. And I will save the answer for that. I could reveal it, but I'm not going to. I will just say it's definitely not Kaiser. He's definitely like the bottom of most right. So, but he justifies himself with Hegel. So my friend Mr. Amazing loves Hegel. So how about you talk a little about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Shae. I run the YouTube channel Mr. Amazing and all the related social media. It's, I guess, my brand online. I'm very interested in the intersection of, I would say, close intellectual reading of core texts and cultural criticism. So that comes to something like a connection between the way the greatest minds in human history have thought about the world and the way we kind of live in the aftermath of their thoughts. So recently that's taken the shape of music analysis, but for me it also intersects with, I think, movements online, digital aesthetics, and the kind of ways that people online make sense of their experiences.
Right. So this is and this is definitely right. I have, of course, done a lot of talking about music and stuff. So definitely at home we might do a music analysis together or something. There's one I have in mind. But either way, let's get you've never seen this before, right?
Nope, never seen it.
All right. So you have the power to pause it. I have the power to pause it. So if you see anything, you can pause and we'll talk. But without
Okay.
further ado, the guy who wants to bring back the Roman Empire because of Hegel. 3, 2, 1, Kaiser.
What did you want to know? I used Imperial Rome as the model for my legion precisely because it was so foreign, so alien. I'd seen what had become of the NCR's attempts to emulate the culture of pre-war America, the infighting, the corruption. Rome was a highly militarized autocracy that effectively integrated the foreign cultures it conquered. It dedicated its citizens to something higher than themselves, to the idea of Rome itself. In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world, a society that could and would survive, a society that could prevent mankind from fracturing and destroying itself in this new world by establishing a new Pax Romana. It means a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers. Long-term stability at all costs. The individual has no value beyond his utility to the state, whether as an instrument of war or production. No, I'll destroy it because it's inevitable that it be destroyed. It's Hegelian dialectics, not personal animosity. How do I put this basically enough? It's a philosophical theory, the kind you might encounter if you took time to read some books. The fundamental premise is to envision history as a sequence of dialectical conflicts. Each dialectic begins with a proposition, a thesis, which inherently contains or creates its opposite, and antithesis. Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable, but the resolution of the conflict yields something new, a synthesis, eliminating the flaws in each, leaving behind common elements and ideas. The bombs wiped the slate clean. Human civilization descended to a level of ignorance that effectively set our cultural progress back to zero. The NCR has all the problems of the ancient Roman Republic: extreme bureaucracy, corruption, extensive senatorial infighting. Just as with the ancient Republic, it is natural that a military force should conquer and transform the NCR into a military dictatorship. Thesis and antithesis. The Colorado River is my Rubicon. The NCR Council will be eradicated, but the new synthesis will change the Legion as well, from a basically nomadic army to a standing military force that protects its citizens and the power of its dictator. What else did you...
All right, let's stop there. So
Yeah, I was going to pause it right now anyway.
So
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think what's interesting is two things. First, that he's thinking in terms of Rome. This is, of course, I haven't read all of Hegel's lectures on history. For Hegel, the really big idea is what he calls world historicity. And there is something that's very close to what Hegel would get at in what's being said here. And it is the idea that certain major events change the impact of world history precisely because of what they are. And the big one for Hegel is Napoleon, who took himself to be establishing a new Rome in a manner of speaking. But for Hegel, this isn't per se a question of peace. It isn't per se a question of security. It's a question of freedom. And freedom means something very specific for Hegel. It is certainly related to the security of the state. But this is not the end goal. The end goal is something much different. And so, from a Hegelian standpoint, the Romans are quite antiquated, and they are quite unconscious. And so, another big idea for Hegel is that reason is progressively unfolding through history. And what that means is freedom is expanding throughout history because more ideas are able to, you could say, attack reality and fit it under themselves. And the ultimate end of that process of attacking reality and fitting it beneath ideas is the freedom of both the individual and the collective. For Hegel, the collective is primary and anterior and prior to the individual. But the kind of move that's being made here where the individual is meaningless is logically fallacious from a Hegelian standpoint, because the phenomenology begins about a third of the way through with a logical deduction of what it is to be an organism. And it is only once you pass through this that you later get to a second iteration of the master-slave dialectic, namely two physical beings, two organisms that are in conflict with each other. But all this is to say, Hegel's schema presupposes the individual as a free agent. So there's a big mistake being made there doubly, both about the idolization of Rome from a Hegelian standpoint and from what Rome even would be from a Hegelian standpoint. Those are some subtler things. The really obvious thing that's interesting, too, is the common mistake of attributing the thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure to Hegel. That's not a Hegelian terminology. That comes from another post-Kantian philosopher, Fichte. Hegel's schema is more like abstract, negative, concrete, where concrete is negative of the negative. So it's a bit hair-splitting because it comes to something very similar to a thesis-antithesis structure, but as opposed to just saying one thing is opposed to another, the abstraction in a Hegelian triad is a kind of generality or a general law or a general principle that undergoes what Hegel calls reflection into itself. So the general principle encounters itself in a concrete instance, and it's in that concrete instance that negation is generated, because there's something always that is co-present with the general principle. And it's not that what is co-present is opposed to it, but that because everything is always multiple, as soon as the abstract enters into something concrete, it is always through something negative. Now, this means that we're talking about concepts and principles. We're not talking about statements. And so then we're not talking about what we could call a toolkit for the justification of action. That's not what Hegel is after, and that's not what his dialectics are doing. They are a means to the end of describing the unfolding of reason through history. And this ultimately culminates in something like what Hegel calls absolute spirit, which is absolute reason. And he does think it has been achieved in his project. He thinks that by writing a system that begins from absolutely logical principles that are extremely general, and by gradually negating them and making them more concrete, you eventually just achieve his system. And it's no surprise then that he calls himself a philosopher at the end of history, because he's achieved the most concrete iteration of reason. So that's all really subtle philosophical stuff. What I think Kaiser here is much closer to is Marx's understanding of Hegel's dialectics.
Oh,
But Marx,
yes.
And Marx famously says that he turns Hegel on his head, and he then says more properly, he actually situates Hegel on his feet. Because from Marx's stand, Hegel is a mystic. He is idealistic in not the obvious sense of, oh, your head is in the clouds, but in this German sense of the ideal, the concept, or what in the German is called the Begriff, which is cognate with the English grip. So it means literally be gripping something, holding on to it. In the mind, this is prior to reality as a condition for the gripping of something with the mind.
Because Marx is, of course, a historical materialist. He's looking at history as a science.
Exactly. And so you can take dialectics then, and I don't think even Marx uses the thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure. This is an anachronism, but you can take dialectics then and make them into a political tool that does justify action, because if you are looking at the real actions of material objects and beings, and human beings at that, which are conditions for their reflection into a conceptual scheme, that is, if you prioritize the condition and not the concept, then you can say, well, we've invented this tool, dialectics. We can use it to justify our action. And Marx and Lenin will do something like this. But Hegel doesn't, as far as I know. Because Hegel doesn't orient his philosophical project to political action. Now, there were some followers of Hegel that did this. They were called the young Hegelians, the left Hegelians, of which Marx was one. But there were also right Hegelians, old Hegelians they were called, because Hegel's project was not immediately politically useful in the way Kaiser would want it to be. And it's in that way that he's
from what you take Kaiser to be, if you could put him on the political spectrum, do you think he's more just Hitler in a way? Or
so he's very close to one of Hegel's latter-day followers under Mussolini, Giovanni Gentile, who I would imagine the writers probably took inspiration from as they were writing this. And Gentile takes inspiration from the old Hegelians, and Gentile has this phrase, fascism is the religion of state. And this is the most conservative rendering of Hegel that you can imagine. For Hegel...
You don't think this guy's going to give everyone free health care?
No, no, no. I mean, it's in some ways a very narrow reading of Hegel that mistakes what his project is for a political action program that I don't even think Gentile would have properly used. What Gentile pulls from Hegel is what Hegel does in the philosophy of right, where the state is rendered as what one of Hegel's students called the march of God on earth. So then the state is God on earth. And so if you have a political program that orients itself towards that, you have a religion of state. But the kind of warlike conquesting program that's imminent to that, I don't even think is in Gentile. That's a Marxist-Leninist reading of Hegel, I think.
But you don't think he's politically left-wing? You think he's probably more conservative?
Well, absolutely not. Absolutely conservative. I mean, Rome and its regalia were adored by both Mussolini and Hitler, and Franco as well, for this reason. I mean, the fascists is the idea of a bundle of sticks which held together is thicker than a singular thing. And so we use the Latin in America, e pluribus unum, out of many one, because this is the kind of collectivity here, which, like Hegel, does suppose a priority to the individual.
You know what I'm gonna. Here's the part where I guess we could get pretty political, because I'm starting to think, because if the NCR, if I'm correct, they're basically like corrupt Democrat. I think they're either like they're basically centrists. Like they're not. I don't think they're pretty freaking corrupt. They're definitely not far left. I don't think they're even far right. They're just corrupt politicians, if I'm correct. But yeah, and they don't originally come off that way. They come off as nice leaders, but of course, I think it's just like the facade of meaning well when they don't really. But they're definitely still better than this guy. So
right.
in a way, would you say that because this game definitely came out before Trump, would you say that this is sort of like what's happening right here? If we say this guy is a fascist, I mean, again, you can side with anyone. There's 4 people you can side with. You can side with, actually, basically most of them are, none of them are really far left wing. You can side with the NCR, or basically like corrupt centrists. Side that's the guy who's clearly a fascist. You can just side with the fucking owner of the Vegas Strip, basically of all the casinos, who's lived like 200 years, and then, or you can just side on your own. You can side with the yes man, which is just literally just a bot that tells you, that just affirms your every action. So basically, you're the new ruler, and you get to make this ambiguous end that most people will definitely side with. Though some people would say, well, what's going to happen after you're gone? The world's going to go to hell again. So, but it's generally like, oh, well, everything else is bad, so I'll just make my own world. But outside of yes man, no one's yet. Again, the whole point is, again, none of these options are really nice. And obviously, with the yes man, there's what's going to happen after you leave. So, like,
right.
So basically,
well, I would say what's happening here is a phenomenon that Hegel has already kind of tracked. Hegel is a neo-Aristotelian, and one of Aristotle's basic ideas is that leisure or free time is the basis of culture or human civilization. And until you have leisure, you don't have civilization. Now, the condition for leisure in Aristotle's time was slavery. Now, and Hegel too finds this anathema, but the basic idea, if you liberalize it, is you have to have an economic base of security before you get leisure, which thereby makes culture, which thereby makes secure human civilization. And Hegel endorses this idea. And so he says at some points to the contrary, that when these kind of conditions are insecure, reason does not advance in the world. And it's at those very moments that Marx will latch on and make that the full program Hegel, you get them in very brief snippets, because it's already in Aristotle and Aristotelian. But anyway, that's to say, I think Hegel would already diagnose the situation as one that's deeply regressive and would say, yes, this is, of course they're all going to be slightly right-wing because they are looking at conditions of insecurity and they are attempting to make a security out of them, which would ultimately lead to, I don't know, some kind of different political regime, if you wanted to be charitable, but maybe not.
So, but I mean, I guess do you think this game maybe is projecting the rise of fascists around both in America and in Europe right now?
I think so.
In what way?
I mean, I would, reading this through a more materialist, Marxist-Leninist lens, say that when you have conditions of material insecurity, the first task will be achieving that security. And you do that through the diminution of every other aspect of culture that doesn't exactly produce that security. And what does that ultimately come to? Well, it comes to a rejection of any kind of expansion of reason that allows us to cooperate with other human beings. Mm-hmm. You don't need toleration. You don't need freedom if the first thing on your mind is eating in the morning. People will willingly submit if they just need food. But that's a quite regressive idea. That is, in fact, the way the Romans operated. And so in this way, Kaiser is not wrong that they were so successfully able to integrate other cultures because everybody was living, in conditions of dereliction and destitution.
Oh, I mean, there is one thing he does is that it's the homogeneous. When I talked about this with Joshua, that I believe the Roman Empire was not homogeneous. They all swore oath to Rome, but they were very culturally not very culturally diverse. This is what I think in League of Legends, which, even though it's not coded as Rome, it's more coded as just an empire. But I think Noxus actually gets better with everyone it conquers. They allow their culture to remain intact, and to some extent.
Right.
There's
a kind of idealistic mistake being made here that the priority of allegiance to the state will somehow create security and prosperity. No. The history of Rome is a history of very shrewd land reform and agricultural moves, territorial expansion, and then trade. It's a history of commercial success at every turn, pretty much. And Rome begins to decline when trade networks break down. So famously, the Gracchus brothers began instituting a early form of welfare because there simply wasn't a secure means for people to make an income. Mm-hmm. And this is, just around the same time that a lot of the coups happen that then eventually result in the total incoherence of the Senate as a political institution and the downfall and ultimately sacking of Rome in the 400s. So again, this is a materialist reading of history. So I would say that that's kind of being done here, but quietly.
We should still fit it. That's his main. See what else he has to say.
I want to know. Do you want my opinion as a former citizen or future conqueror? Actually, my opinion is the same either way. As a young man, I was taught to venerate President Tandy of Shady Sands, the founding mother of the new California Republic. Did you know her presidency lasted 52 years? And that her father, Aradesh, was the Republic's first president? Does that sound like a democracy to you? Or a hereditary dictatorship? Because the council didn't dare oppose her. She was too popular. She had the people's love. So things ran smoothly, more or less. And as soon as she was gone, as soon as there really could be democracy, what happened then? Ever since losing its queen, the NCR has been weaker, more diffuse. Democracy has been its weakness, not its strength. Greed runs rampant. The government is corrupt, accepting bribes from Brahmin barons and landowners to the detriment of citizens. The NCR is a loose conglomerate of individuals looking out for themselves. It's lost virtue. No one cares about the collective, the greater good. It's not built to last. I'm just hastening the inevitable. Of course, the most powerful my legion has faced. Also the first to which I am ideologically opposed. Until now, every tribe I've conquered has been so backwards and stunted, enslavement has been a gift bestowed upon them. My conquest of the Mojave will be a glorious triumph, marking the transition of the Legion from a basically nomadic tribe to a genuine empire. Just as my namesake campaigned in Gaul before he crossed the Rubicon, so have I campaigned and will cross the Colorado. What else did you want to know? The worst impulses of mankind concentrated in one insane backward tribe. The Brotherhood seems to have formed not long after the Great Atomic War. It's hard to know. They care little for history. Some of the Brotherhood scribes we captured further east didn't even know the name of their founder, Roger Maxon. They like to pretty up their mission with trappings of chivalry. But the truth is, they're hoarders. They hoard technology. It's been 200 years, and they still have the mentality of scavengers. They say they're preserving these technologies, but for what? They have no vision. They offer no future. They're a dead end. You don't think very far ahead, do you? Sure, their hatred of the NCR would seem to qualify them for use as proxies. But then, what do you do with them? Each paladin is quite powerful. I'd have to be convinced that present benefits outweighed future costs. It's called an autodoc. As the name suggests, it's an automated physician, more or less. He can treat broken bones, cuts, punctures, scrapes.
Right. What else? Did you get anything else from that?
Yeah, there was one bit a little bit ago, just before he likened himself to the actual historical Caesar, but I forget exactly what it was. Oh, yes. The idea of democracy being a weakness, and then also the NCR as being a corrupt, self-interested, and then the idea of virtue as an orientation to the common good. I mean, this is really more, again, an Aristotelian idea, but it's being used in this almost retrograde way rather than a descriptive way. So for Aristotle, virtue is a description of reality. It is not per se prescribing something. It's telling you what will be the case if, in fact, you do what reality demands of you. And so what we now derive as a distinction between is and ought is not the case for Aristotle. So virtue for him is not something that you say, oh, well, those people aren't virtuous, therefore they don't orient themselves to the common good. You would say, there's no instance of common good, therefore they're not virtuous. As so the causal priority is different, because in the latter case, you're describing a social illness and then saying that the people are failing, not the people are failing, therefore it's a social illness. And you might say, well, what's the difference? You're just flipping things around. But for political theory and for political action, it's actually quite a profound difference, because Kaiser could say, well, my people are virtuous. But how the fuck do we know that? How does anybody know that? You can't justify that. And what I'm saying is a very common sense political intuition. Like, of course you would say your people are virtuous. You want to be the one in power. And Aristotle has already kind of said this over 2,000 years ago, at this much more diffuse level, through what I'm calling the priority of the collective to the individual. Not in the sense that Kaiser is, again, putting it that the individual is dissolved in the collective, but in the sense that you have to describe the social condition and say, well, then the people who are running the show are doing things the wrong way, because you do not achieve that kind of self-conscious action that necessarily produces virtue. You can't say you are the virtuous one. That's not how any of this works. Once you've made that move, you've already done something the virtuous man would not do, on one reading of Aristotle anyway. because
So,
you're making a rhetorical move. And you're saying, because I'm the virtuous one, I should be in power. And that's not what the virtuous man does.
so how brilliant do you think this is? You think every mistake he's making with Hegel is intentional? Is intentional from the writing standpoint?
I mean, it's very rhetorically effective, and it's brilliant strategically, I think, and tactically, but it's not well thought out, I don't think.
I'm saying, but based on the meta analysis of the writers writing this, do you think they intentionally distort Hegel, and they distort Hegel intentionally?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hegel's ideas and Aristotle's ideas, which are kind of transformed through Machiavelli, and I was going to say, I mean, what is being spoken to here is more Machiavellian ideal of virtue rather than an Aristotelian one, but that's neither here nor there for the moment. These are very useful ideas that can be twisted as justifications for action, but that's not what these ideas were written for, and that's not, like, you can't really use them in that way without distorting them. And
what is Hegel's husband?
he, like, let's say Kaiser was, already leading the state. Hegel would be useful for surveying the state of the state, surveying the way the state is being run, and looking back to 20 years prior, let's say, and collecting data and saying, how did events X, Y, and Z produce our current situation? And once you've done that kind of historical analysis, Hegel gives you a conclusion, and he gives you a certain way to see how those events are connected, and then to move forward, not because you are an agent of history, but because you've done rigorous work that tells you how things happen, gives you an informed decision about how to move forward next. But this is a mistake Marx makes as well.
In what way?
Well, Marx thinks that he and his group just so happen to be the next iteration of self-consciousness that unfolds reason in history. Who would have thought that they would be the ones? So you get this kind of almost circular, self-congratulating move that Hegel also makes. Oh, of course Hegel is the one who ends history. Of course Kaiser is the one who will create the new Rome, because he's the one who sees the truth. And so it becomes a kind of prophetic move in that way, which if philosophers since Hegel, post-Hegelians, have worked very hard to recover, because it's arguably the reason the Soviet Union failed, and it's arguably the reason fascism even came to exist. In part, other reasons, but philosophically, this is one of them. So, from the writer's standpoint, I think they've done exactly what somebody in Kaiser's position would do with this information. I mean, this is the way Lenin, in part, read Hegel. And, of course, it produced success. So that's another question, I think. Because it ultimately produced failure, ultimately. But then you're getting into, like, historical, political issues. I don't know if we have time.
Anything else you'd like to bring up?
Just that I think it's very well written. I think it's very good. And I can see the appeal of both thinking in this way and playing this game, because he's a very compelling character. I think he's wrong.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, but yeah, I mean, again, he's one of 4 people you can cite. So I think people, there are people who I think he's right. There are people I've heard think he's right. But
no, right? Seriously?
I've only heard this. I can ask my friends, people who actually know this, but I feel like generally it's usually definitely the guy that is the least liked, I would say, out of the 4 options.
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of regressive consciousness, a regressive awareness of reality that supposes these kind of basic brute facts, namely divide, conquer, pillage, etc., which leaves a whole lot out. But if you're in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, making the Marxist materialist move, it makes sense to think like that.
the one thing I'm guessing is that I don't know if Kaiser thinks that this is the end, that once he does all of this, that it will eventually end in some sort of, I guess, Übermensch utopia. Like he might bring about the Übermensch. I know he doesn't cite Nietzsche, but it sounds like that we can enter the super moral age after he's done all this bad. Like he has to be the necessary devil to bring about a better end. That's what it's also sort of, if you give him a more charitable argument. That's what it sort of seems like.
Yeah. I mean, you could call him the negation of the status quo. And so you could do a Hegelian reading of this and you could say, well, the abstract condition of incoherence in this post-apocalyptic world demands the negation of itself, namely Kaiser, who will make the concrete reality, which is Pax Romana or whatever. You could do that.
And then I think he might say that, someone will take me over and they'll be the devil. I know that someone would say that. Someone might,
But then the test would still be human freedom, and freedom in the distinctly Hegelian sense of reason in history, which means the greater inclusion of facts about reality under concepts. And politically, this means what today we call just basic progressive politics is, in this way, slightly Hegelian. And if you're not getting that with somebody like Kaiser, then it's just regression. And this is how you could, from one Hegelian standpoint, even critique fascists and say, well, they're not really Hegelians because they're leaving a whole lot out of what his project actually is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm starting to think about. I forget. Have you or have you not seen Code Geass?
I have not. I've heard of it though.
Oh God,
heard good things.
Very good things. Again, that anime has an interesting synthesis idea. It doesn't cite Hegel directly, but it's interesting philosophical notions to the ending. But that's a whole other thing. I'm thinking about but here in a minute. Yeah. I guess there's anything else?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Well,
sometimes I bestow its use upon someone I favor. Makes for a powerful gift in a culture that forbids painkillers and is largely ignorant of medical science.
Okay. Well, there you go. Anything else to say on that or no?
No, not really. I mean, I think I said all that there really is to say. I think at the end of the day, he is, and his figure represents an opportunistic thinker who, he's more Machiavellian than Hegelian at really the end of the day. This could be a cross-section of a chapter of The Prince. It in fact is, and the sections in which Machiavelli calls on Lorenzo de' Medici to, overthrow the corrupt bankers in Florence is precisely what Kaiser is talking about here. An incoherent oligarchic elite is in need of a strong man who can implement a set of norms as upheld by a legion of militarized followers. That is Machiavelli's agenda, depending on how you read the text.
All right. This has been David Lee. Well, would you like to say where else you can be found? I'll put your socials definitely.
Yeah, you can find me twitter.com/MrAmazingYT, youtube.com/MrAmazing, and facebook.com/MrAmazingOfficial. Those are the three big ones. Thanks so much for having me, David. Really appreciate taking the time to do this. I always love to talk. I hope your viewers like it. Hope it was a good time.
Well, it leaves with philosophy. Peace.